Ms Banks.
Mr Narev, Mr Cohen, thank you for joining us. Mr Narev, I'd like to use your words, strength and fairness. In my view, the Commonwealth Bank has got strength right, but there's work to do on fairness. And in relation to strength, it's indisputable that the Australian banking industry is strong, and Australians should be very proud of that. Indeed, I was working with the Anglo-American company at the time of the GFC. It's still, to this day, lauded around the world in terms of the strength of our banking industry, largely due to our current regulations, prudential regulation. The world saw what happened, to put it bluntly, in relation to when banks aren't strong, i.e. in Greece. But more importantly, and indeed, a Royal Commission would go to destabilising that image. There's no question about that. But more importantly, a Royal Commission, in the Turnbull government's view, it could take 2 to 10 years, or it's not just our view, it's the reality. 2 to 10 years, there'll be no practical deliverable outcomes for bank consumers, and there will be basically the only beneficiaries will be your lawyers, quite frankly, the banking lawyers. So my point is that the point of my questioning is more about the fairness component and putting some heart into this issue. You talk a lot about putting things right when things go wrong, and you have referred on a number of occasions that you're very strong in identifying mistakes and putting them right. Reflecting on the October hearings, the most shocking thing for me was when you said to this committee that the first time you heard about the CommInsure cases was when they came to the media. Now, it seems, and it's quite obvious, again, on the facts, that there are things that continue to happen. And yet, when I refer to Recommendation 7, the Commonwealth Bank have said that, no, it's all okay, we're relying on CPS 220 in relation to APRA and ASIC and regulations. Now, do you confirm that is your that is your response to
Yes,
Recommendation 7? Yeah. Okay, so just going to that point. Mr Narev, how did you feel when you saw those cases on the Four Corners program?
I felt distressed for the customers, and I felt very concerned that any customer of the Commonwealth Bank in any part of the business, regardless of the circumstances, was in that position. And
indeed, there's been several cases since where you've come out publicly and said you personally apologised and you've done things to create that redress, but these have all been after the event. Now, the risk management framework that we are suggesting is outside the prism of a banking lawyer's mind. It is a risk management framework that is utilised in fast-moving consumer good organisations, and it's basically a trigger alert system so that you can become aware of these things before they make you aware of them. So before they make you aware of them in the media or whatever. So it's basically a preventative mechanism. So clearly something is broken in terms of identifying risk. And part of the risk that the bank needs to see, and this is where I think CPS 220 and APRA and ASIC have a very limited application. And I really implore your lawyers and your corporate affairs people, and perhaps instruct lawyers outside of the banking industry that work in another highly regulated industry, where they will see that there are risk management frameworks that you can implement that are constructive and that will bring about the culture change that's required. When I reflect on those CommInsure cases, and indeed on all the other cases, having experienced a cancer diagnosis in my life myself, I know that the one thing that is really devastating to you personally is that your emotional strength is destroyed. And the last thing you want to be doing is getting in a fight, let alone a fight with a bank, a dispute with a bank. And it's not going to help, and sometimes it's too late, and it has been too late for some of these people, where that the CEO apologises. So I really believe that if the bank is truly serious about this, I'd ask that you take your lead in terms of reviewing this risk management framework that we've suggested in recommendation 7. Will you take that on notice?
Yes, and if I can just respond briefly. I do recall we had a discussion along similar lines last time, and I want to make a couple of points. Number one is, as the Chief Executive, my response and my thoughts always start with the individual cases. And I've said before, any discussion where we say anything, I want to emphasise the importance of every individual case. What I do need to emphasise as well, though, is that during the time that those cases arose, we paid 100,000 claims. And the vast majority, and some of those claims involved dissatisfied customers as well.
Indeed.
And the vast majority of those did come through normal processes. Now, that said, we will always believe we can do better. We take, as we did last time, your observations on this seriously. We do believe that the mechanisms in place with the regulator are sufficient. But that by no means says we can't do better.
Can I just stop you there? The current regulations are required every 3 years. A normal risk management framework, it's agile, flexible, it's every year, and it's monitored throughout the year. That is the framework that should be working adjacent to the current framework that's in place. Something clearly constructive has to change in the banking industry for the banks. And you haven't had the benefit of seeing this yet, but indeed the CEO who's going to follow you is going to look, has indicated that he will consider this more readily. A 3-year time period, it's way too long. That's the time factor for starters. The other thing is CPS 220 goes to banking risk, goes to financial risk, goes to material interest. So therefore, all these smaller consumer matters, and that's what we're here for the bank customer, for the bank consumer. As a consolidated event, they look good, and that's when they appear in the press. Whereas a risk management framework which would catch them and trigger them, so you don't spend your time identifying them and coming forward with them. So that's why I'd like to, really ask that you give strong consideration to a really, really robust framework.
We will give consideration. I just make one other point. Every year our board is required to certify its satisfaction with our risk management frameworks under APRA regulation.
Yeah.
And I think it is very important to make sure that ultimately responsibility for managing the company and governing it for the benefit of all the stakeholders, including consumers, should rest with the boards and the management with appropriate regulatory oversight.
Okay. And can I ask that you have to get your skates on in terms of this risk management framework, because another reason we want this House Banking Inquiry, we want it to come out with deliverable outcomes. So, for example, we've put a deadline of the end of this year in relation to recommendation 7. It's imperative that we get this done now. We can't engage in a talk fest that's going to go on for years and years. We need to get results now, hence the one-stop shop tribunal, but for those that do slip through the net, but something constructive needs to be done at the front end in relation to that. Now, I'd just like to go to your Deloitte report, which, and I won't go into detail, but but this goes to the same point I'm making. So it was designed by the Commonwealth Bank Board. The terms of reference are very, very limited terms of reference. Deloitte's are indeed your suppliers, so no doubt you paid them for the report, and you issued a media release soon afterwards, and your corporate affairs people did a stunning job of picking out all the good stuff out of the report. But basically the report said that it's not a systemic issue. But for many of these matters that we're seeing, they don't necessarily have to be systemic to be bad. So I suggest, again, in relation to this report, that you take that for what it is, because it still does, notwithstanding its limitations, it still does. There are weaknesses in staff training, there's lack of accuracy in reporting, there's lack of accuracy, and CommInsure people need some clear communications training skills. All those things would be embedded in a risk management framework. So, I think where that report is flawed in the sense that it's talking about, and indeed you've said, you're confident that no one's engaging in willful misconduct, but it's often not the willful misconduct that causes the issues, it's the negligent misconduct, or it's the lazy misconduct, or it's the sloppy misconduct. And that is why, again, I come to my point that with a sense of urgency, I put it to you that the banks need to look very constructively outside of the paradigm of APRA and ASIC and look into a constructive, internal, robust risk management framework in line with Recommendation 7. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, look, just quickly on the CommonSure report, I mean, yes, there are certainly recommendations, and at the same time as APRA said that the report was robust and independent, and I just want to come back to that, those who claim it's not really need to engage in the question of why we have a regulator who has said it is independent and robust. Now, Deloitte is a firm of global reputation. Some have sought fit to claim it's not independent. We strongly disagree, and I'm sure Deloitte would. But the reality is you've also got...
I'm not disputing their independence, Mr Narev. I'm basically saying to you that it was a limited terms of reference and it doesn't go to that fairness issue. In fact, and I know they looked at many cases and all the rest of it, but what I'm talking about is those bank customers. They're the ones we want to help and we want to help fast.
And we agree fully with that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms Banks. Ms King.
Thank you, Chair. And